Students, this is the first set of notes about geologic time. And it's about the age of the Earth and the Earth's early history and kind of the overall view of Earth's history. This is part of the combined unit between maps and geologic time, but this is the first set of notes about geologic time. As always, you're going to write down everything that's in orange text. And the title of the notes is Geologic Time Notes Part 1. Pause the video if you need more time, and at the end there will be a slide that kind of captures everything. So this unit is about geologic time, which means very, very long spans of time. Scientists use rocks and fossils to figure out what happened long ago. So the Earth is 4.6 billion years old. You might remember that from the astronomy unit. Billion with a B, not million, so a very, very, very long time. And this is the amount of time that has passed since our solar system's formation. Pretend for a moment that it would be possible to witness everything that happened on Earth since the beginning. In order to do that, you would have to live as long as a human lifetime, more than 57 million times over. So a normal human life is roughly about 80 years. You'd have to do that 57 million times back to back, in order to see the whole history of the Earth. 4.6 billion years is an almost unfathomable length of time. Luckily, we can study rocks and fossils to piece together what happened in the distant past. That's why we call this longer view of history geologic history, or geologic time, because we use rocks and fossils to figure it out. Geo means rock. The Precambrian. Over the course of 4.6 billion years, the landscape of Earth has changed quite a bit, and so have the creatures that live here. The first several billion years of Earth's history had very few notable events and not very many living things. This was Precambrian time, and the Earth was a geologically interesting planet, but almost all life was single-celled bacteria. During the Precambrian, the planet was not a very hospitable place for life. Volcanism was rampant, temperature fluctuated dramatically, meteors pummeled the planet, and for the first 2 billion years or so, there was no oxygen in the atmosphere. The moon formed when Earth collided with another celestial body. This all happened during Precambrian time. So that's the artist's depiction of the Earth colliding with another celestial body. Scientists theorized that that is the way the moon formed. And the Precambrian time span comprises more than 80% of the Earth's entire history. So for almost Earth's entire history, there wasn't a whole lot going on biologically. There was life during the Precambrian, but it was all single-celled organisms. The first living things that lived on Earth were chemosynthetic anaerobic bacteria. This means they didn't require sunlight or oxygen to survive. They lived in the ocean, and it's probable that these first organisms lived near structures we call hydrothermal vents that we talked about in the oceans unit. And they look something like this. They're called black smokers as well. They're little chimney structures that pump hot water, nutrient-rich, mineral-rich water into the ocean from the bottom. Here's an artist's depiction of Precambrian time. So during the Precambrian, some special bacteria known as cyanobacteria or blue-green algae evolved to use sunlight for energy. A process called, drumroll please, photosynthesis. They began releasing oxygen into the atmosphere. If you recall from biology, photosynthesis is the process by which plants take carbon dioxide and use the carbon to build sugars and then release oxygen into the atmosphere. And the chemical formula is carbon dioxide and water, plus the energy from the sun. And they turn it into glucose, which is the sugar that makes up the plant's bodies, and then they release oxygen. At first, all the new free oxygen was immediately bound to minerals like iron oxide, but eventually there were no more minerals to connect with. For many of the simple anaerobic organisms that lived on Earth at the time, oxygen was a toxic waste product, and many of them died as a result of this development, the Great Oxygenation Event. Here's a little cartoon depicting that. The yellow one would be the anaerobic bacteria. So these new photosynthetic cyanobacteria were extremely successful, and the oxygen piled up in the atmosphere. This is known as the Great Oxygenation Event. It caused the extinction of countless bacteria species, and it affected the temperature of the planet. You can still see cyanobacteria today. Whenever there is an algae bloom, cyanobacteria are often one of the main types of algae involved. Here's a picture of an algae bloom. This is the percent composition of the Earth's atmosphere starting near the beginning. At first, mostly carbon dioxide and hydrogen and nitrogen. Then oxygen, about 2 billion years ago, starts coming onto the scene. The Cambrian explosion. So around the same time as the Great Oxygenation Event, you start seeing the first multicellular species alongside the single-celled bacteria. But life in general was very simple until it wasn't. So we have 541 million years ago an event called the Cambrian explosion. And when I say an event, it's more like a period. It lasted about 10 to 20 million years, and it's the period of time in which lots of multicellular plants and animals appear on the fossil record. And it was the beginning of what we'd call the Age of Invertebrates. So nothing with a backbone. All life was still in the ocean. Here is an artist's depiction of the Cambrian explosion. At this point, all life was still in the ocean, and this is when Earth's ocean began to resemble what they look like today. It took another 100 million years or so for life to move onto land. So the Cambrian explosion represents a new geologic age. So the Precambrian ends, and then we start what's called the Paleozoic era. So the Cambrian explosion is a new geologic age because the fossil record changed. So when scientists study fossils from the Paleozoic, there's lots of trilobites, for example. But if you study fossils from before 451 million years ago, it's all single-celled organisms, or mostly single-celled organisms. And so it marks a dramatic change in the fossils present. Rocks of a certain age have only single-celled bacteria in them, and then when you get to a certain point in Earth's history, you start seeing more multicellular organisms. That's the Cambrian explosion. And so it punctuates the geologic timeline and creates a new geologic age. But that's up to the scientists' discretion when to mark that new geologic age, and they mark it by changes in the fossil record. Another way scientists characterize the beginning and end of a geologic time period is a mass extinction. Mass extinctions events happen when at least 75% of all species on the planet go extinct in a relatively short time frame. There have been 5 major extinctions throughout the geologic history of Earth, the most famous being when the meteor came and ended the dinosaurs. So think of geologic time as the deeper you dig, the further back in time you go. If you dig deep enough to get back to the age of invertebrates, which is the Paleozoic, your fossils are going to be different than if you only dug down to the Mesozoic. The Cenozoic is the age of mammals, which we're still in today. So here's the extinction events, the 5 major ones. We have the Ordovician-Silurian extinction, that's 440 million years ago. The Devonian extinction, 365 million years ago. The Permian-Triassic extinction, 250 million years ago. The Triassic-Jurassic extinction, 210 million years ago. And then the Cretaceous-Tertiary extinction, the most recent, which was 65 million years ago. These are the 5 major extinction events in Earth's history. And notice how they all have to do with the time period, and a lot of them show the names of 2 different time periods because you're ending one period of geologic time and starting a new one because the fossil record often changes dramatically. Notice that these extinction events occur at the boundary of 2 geologic periods. This is not a coincidence. Changes in the fossil record are what paleontologists use to delineate the sections of geologic time. For example, the Cambrian period starts with the Cambrian explosion, and the Cenozoic era starts with the dinosaur extinction. So here is a graph showing the extinction events and how the number of species on the planet decreased each time. And you see, before the Cambrian explosion, there's a limited fossil record. The geologic timescale. The geologic timescale is a timeline that divides all of Earth's history into chronological units. It's a rough sketch based upon major changes in the fossil record, such as extinction events. The intervals used in the timeline are eons, eras, periods, and epochs. An eon is the biggest unit, ranging in length from 500 million years to 1 billion years. We are in the Phanerozoic eon now, which started at the Cambrian explosion 541 million years ago. There have been several eons before this one, but usually we just lump those all together as Precambrian time, because those eons were not very eventful in terms of fossils. So the further back in time you go, if you get back to Precambrian time, there's less fossils to kind of discern what the different periods are. So it's mostly just eons back in the Precambrian time. So here's this picture again. You've got the archaeologists on top getting ready to dig. If they just dig a little bit, they're going to be in the Cenozoic. If they dig really deep, they're going to be in the Mesozoic. If they dig really, really, really deep, it's Paleozoic. And then the deepest would be the Precambrian. And that's a simplified version, obviously. So right now we're in the Holocene epoch, which is part of the Quaternary period, which is part of the Cenozoic era, and the Phanerozoic eon. That is present day and going back in time some as well. Here's another depiction of the geologic timescale. This is a little blurry and it's hard to see, but this has just another way to look at it. So if a paleontologist finds a fossil, a paleontologist is a scientist that studies fossils, and the rock is dated to 66 million years ago. That fossil is from the late Cretaceous epoch, which is part of the Cretaceous period, which is part of the Mesozoic era, the age of reptiles, and part of the Phanerozoic eon, which is still happening. So find 66 million years ago, 66 MA. Around that is the Cretaceous period, which is part of the Mesozoic era, which is part of the Phanerozoic eon. Right now we're in the Holocene epoch, which is part of the Quaternary period, which is part of the Cenozoic era, as part of the Phanerozoic eon as well. Sometimes a paleontologist can tell how old a rock is just based on the fossils that are present. More on that to come. So the intervals of geologic time, the denominations, eon are the largest divisions. Eons are divided into eras. Eras are a unit that includes 2 or more periods. Periods are a unit that includes 2 or more epochs, and epochs are the smallest division. Multiple epochs make up a period. So look how the epochs are smaller. The periods are a little larger, the eras are a little larger, and then the eons are the biggest. Now, Proterozoic, Archean, and Hadean, those are just as long as the Phanerozoic, actually longer, but they're not shown as being super duper long because there's just not that much going on fossil-wise. But that Precambrian time, all the red and the pink at the bottom, that's 80% of Earth's history. So if you showed it the way it ought to be shown, with the Precambrian time taking up the amount of space appropriately based on the amount of time that it took, it would be all Precambrian. But since the Phanerozoic eon that we're part of now is so interesting fossil-wise, we're mostly concerned with that when we talk about fossils. So here's what you need to know about some geologic ages. The Precambrian is the first 80% of Earth's history. Life was mostly bacteria. The moon formed. and it lasted until 541 million years ago. So it was the first 4 billion years of Earth's history, and that was the Cambrian explosion 541 million years ago, which kicked off the Paleozoic era. And the Paleozoic era is the age of invertebrates. Most life is still in the ocean 541 to 250 million years ago. After the Paleozoic, we have the Mesozoic era, which is the age of dinosaurs, 250 to 65 million years ago. Mesozoic is in the middle. It starts with an M. And then the Cenozoic era is the current era that we're in. It's the age of mammals, but it stretches back to lots of extinct species as well, like saber-toothed tigers and giant rhinoceri and such. So are we entering a new geologic age right now? Possibly. There is evidence that suggests we are currently entering Earth's 6th major extinction event, and that is caused by humans. It's normal for some species to go extinct all the time, but right now we have species going extinct at more than 100 times the normal background rate of extinction, because people are doing things like tearing down the rainforests and polluting the planet. Humans are causing many important habitats to change dramatically. A few examples are clear-cutting of rainforests, ocean acidification, and global climate change. Some scientists have already dubbed the new geologic era the Anthropogenic, or the Age of Man. So here's what the geologic time notes look like if you fit it all on one slide. Of course, you are also welcome to handwrite it or use my fill-in-the-blank option. And have a nice day.